All right, welcome everybody. My name is Alan Greyeyes, and I'm the festival director for the sākihiwē Festival. It's been my honor to, I got tapped on the shoulder by Uncle Doug Cox here and Uncle Mark and asked to help out with a bit of education and outreach because I'm a firm believer that every stage gives us an opportunity to educate thousands of people and show Canadians that Indigenous people are just as unique and special as their loved ones. And so again, this was a wonderful opportunity. I immediately thought of Moran, who I've been on a number of committees with. He's an excellent speaker, and he recommended Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux, and I'm excited for our conversation today. We're going to touch on a lot of I think there's a lot of heart-wrenching stuff, and so I'm going to just mention before we start, we have people in the Zoom on the webinar. If you have questions, please just enter them into the chat or the Q&A, and we're going to tackle those in turn. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Wesley-Esquimaux to introduce herself first.
Hi there. It's good to be here, and thanks for getting my name right. He actually got that good. I'm at the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. That's where I'm actually a member here, and I'm living here, and I'm on the Chippewa territory. I'm also the chair on Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University in Orillia and Thunder Bay. I was in Thunder Bay before, and now I'm back in my home territory. And I'm the chair of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba, and the chair for Teach for Canada, which sends teachers into the north to teach properly when they're in a remote community. So welcome to everybody, and I hope we have a good conversation. Please join us. That's the important part. Ask lots of questions. That's what we're here for. Thanks.
And you got work with Roots Canada. Did you mention that, or did I miss that?
Well, the Canadian Roots, yeah, I was one of the co-founders of the Canadian Roots Exchange when I was still teaching at the University of Toronto, which is still going strong. So we managed to frame a pretty strong organization. Yeah.
It looks really great. Rai, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and nice to be in this virtual space with you all. Really look forward to the important conversation that we're going to have today. Indigenous, what can you make an act odem? My name is Rai. I'm speaking to you today from the territories of the Wasanik people, which is way out on the west side of the country, just outside of beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. I've recently moved back to the coast here. I was more or less raised out here, and about 11 years ago, I was called to duty, if you will, and I called out to Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Métis, Winnipeg, Manitoba, where I served both with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and later went on to found the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where I had the great privilege and honor of working with Cynthia and a lot of other incredible people, and you as well through all of this, Alan. So really look forward to the conversation today. It's a tough time that we're going through as a country. There's some really tough histories that we've been talking about actually for a really long period of time as we've gone through this over decade-long process of truth and reconciliation. So I welcome you to the conversation and really look forward to your questions and the dialogue that we're going to have today.
Oh, Miigwech, you brought up a land acknowledgement there. It's something that I forgot to do. I think they play an important role in just normalizing Indigenous cultures and reminding people that, we still exist. We're not a part of this romantic past full of beadwork and feathers. We are real people with real feelings. And just like the 215 plus kids, each of those individual children, there was a young man in there who was allergic to fish. There was a young woman who was had hopes and dreams of being a fashion designer or something along those lines. And there is definitely non-binary folks who, didn't get a chance to live, experience their dreams and hopes and dreams, or to reconnect with their families. So I think it's the land acknowledgements play an important role in reminding Canadians that we're not a part of a romantic past, and that we still exist on these lands. And that being said, I often joke around and say that I'm from Winnipeg, which is Grand Chief territory, because we have more Grand Chiefs per capita than anywhere in the world. So yeah, definitely the homeland of the Métis, and I'm an Anishinaabe, and so we've inhabited these territories since time immemorial. We have Uncle Doug and Mark on the call here. You guys are on camera, actually. I don't know if you knew that, but I'm going to get you guys to introduce yourselves really quickly and maybe talk a bit about this new group that you've put together.
Sure, I'll go first. Thank you, Alan, and our guest speakers. My name is Mark Greenhall, and I'm coming from the traditional territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation, otherwise now known as Penticton, BC. Doug and I had about a minute conversation about what can we do, and we both have pretty extensive networks in the arts and music community in Canada. And being a big fan of music activism, you know, there's so much possibility to spread awareness and knowledge through art and music. And it just seemed like a natural thing that we had to do. So as soon as Doug posed the idea, I was on board in 1 minute, and very grateful to be included in this. And it's a thing of great passion for me. I've been involved with Indigenous music artists for a number of years. I consider myself an ally and a supporter. And so I'm just thrilled to be seeing this initiative take off. And yes, thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Doug?
Hi everybody, I'm Doug Cox. I come from the land of the Puntledge and the Eekson and the Comox people. I live in Comox, BC on Vancouver Island. And yeah, Mark and I were just talking when the news about Kamloops first came out, and kind of going, well, we could go protest or something, but it just feels like it's not enough. And it's people are talking on Facebook all the time now, which is also a great maybe guilt reliever in terms of feeling like you've done something after you've written a post on Facebook. But again, it's not enough, and we both felt like it's really time to try to make some changes happen. And the only way that we can do that is we're both really good at promoting, perhaps, in our music networks, which allows us to speak across the country. Gives us a little bit of power. I've used my power all my life to promote music festivals and that kind of thing. Just felt like it was time to do more, you know, so that's all we're trying to do. We are certainly not trying to speak on behalf of Indigenous people. We feel like we might be able to reach people that don't normally have these kind of conversations as part of their lives. And we just want to be open to anyone who's interested in these discussions to join us. And we're so grateful that you guys are here. I also just want to mention this book real quick. It's called We All Go Back to the Land, and it's about territory acknowledgements. I just got it. I just started to read it. If you're interested, if people question why you're acknowledging territory, read this book. It's very, very smart book. So yeah, thank you. I feel privileged and honored to be here as well.
And Doug and Mark, do you want to stay on the call, or are you thinking of your ducking out? Or, we didn't talk about that beforehand.
I am here to listen and learn. I'm not here to talk.
Myself as well.
You want to just
We're
turn
here.
the cameras off, and then I think that takes you out of the broadcast.
Sure.
Feel free to drop anything in the chat if you need anything from me. Before we get into talking about the National Center and the TRC, I wanted to ask Cynthia, before we jumped on the call, you mentioned how do we maintain the momentum that's coming from these truths that are being revealed? I wanted to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important things that we're up against right now. We have been having this conversation, or trying to have this conversation, with Canada for hundreds of years. Multiple generations have carried this information forward. It has never been put down. And I think that that's an important consideration right there, that every generation has lifted this and said, we have to resolve this. So how do we create sustainability in this conversation in a country that has got lots of crises happening? You know, we had the 215 children found at the Kamloops school, and that created a very big stir. You know, I understand that 44,000 people registered for a MOOC at the University of Alberta. I'm sure they're registering at other universities as well. And then we had the tragic events that happened in London, you know, the Muslim family that was attacked. We've had Asian families attacked because of the COVID pandemic. So there's been a lot of things that kind of come up, and things get lost in the news. So it can't necessarily be the news cycles that we rely upon. We have to rely upon ourselves as people. And, you know, as the arts community, I think has absolutely correctly pointed out, you know, you have access to music that people listen to. The theater is another place that people love to go once we get past this pandemic. And just having the conversation with each other and helping to inform each other, I think, is going to be the way we do it. But we can't stop talking. we can't say, I'm tired of explaining this. And I've had a lot of Indigenous people say that to me, like, I'm tired of explaining to non-Native people what this is all about. You know, they need to go read a book. And yes, I agree. But you know what? If we don't do this, it's not going to happen. So that's the way I think we have to start addressing it. If we know something, let's share it.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I definitely agree, and that's something that I've raised a couple of times in the meetings that I've been in, is the need to maintain momentum and the need to like continue to educate ourselves. And I think my first introduction to these atrocities and these acts of violence against like children was in Wab Kinu's book, and Wab's actually going to join us for another conversation next week, and it's within that, learning about his father's experience and the violence he encountered and the abuse that he encountered. That's when I started to make decisions on how I'm going to act and what I'm going to do to make the world a better place. And so I think it's, even if these people aren't directly related or know people that have gone through these atrocities, I think it's important to keep the momentum going and look past the news cycle. And Rai, is there anything in your experience that has helped maintain momentum? Have you noticed that, like the media dictating what we pay attention to?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Alan. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, when we look at the very deliberate and very conscious language that was chosen by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in framing the 94 calls to action as calls to action, that says is we as individuals, we as a collective have been called to action. The work of reconciliation, the work of truth telling is not something that you can do from the sidelines. You can't just feel it into happening. You have to undertake action. And really at the end of the day, we, each and every one of us, have to ask ourselves on a daily basis what we have done to promote the human rights, human dignity, equality, peacemaking, and healing that are embodied in the aspirational goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's vision for a better and more prosperous country. You know, the place where we oftentimes get tripped up is that Canadians feel like they can't take part in this work. And that idea has to be really rejected on a very fundamental level, I think. We actually have to recognize that so much of the work to be done is actually the work of non-Indigenous peoples in becoming more aware, more attuned to, much more conscious of the patterns of violence that continue to persist in society today and the things that need to change in order to end that violence. And, you know, I've been saying this a lot in the, like, now countless interviews that I've done since the remains of the children were found in Kamloops. It's that, you know, in a society, and this is quoting somebody else, but in a society that is fundamentally racist, it's not enough to just be passively not racist. You actually have to be anti-racist, and you have to be part of the work on a daily and ongoing basis to deconstruct and dismantle the systems of oppression and violence as they continue. So we got to do it each and every day, and we got to wake up and we got to fall asleep doing it.
It is so much the systems, you know, it is so much. When you're saying about systems, it's those systems that have been put in place and the economics that we deal with. And I think we saw that through the pandemic. You know, here, you know, this normal that we thought was so normal, you know, we're now perceiving it, especially through the eyes of a lot of the faith keepers, that how abnormal it was to never get to enough, right? And be so distracted from our own sense of humanity by the acquisition of goods, money, you know, status, power, all of the things that really we should be actually rejecting through this stage that we're now in, and saying, wait a minute, how do we actually, you know, respond to each other as human beings, and how do we get back to that understanding and that spiritual practice, as opposed to always trying to join that rat race and get ahead and get enough and get more. So that's important, that part of it.
Can you either of you tell us about the Truth and Reconciliation, um, the report, and the National Center. I think our audience again is mostly musicians and people in the music industry, and so I wanted to give them an idea of the work that was done and also the resources that are currently available to help them in their efforts.
So I think you should probably talk about the TRC, since that was really something that you were very actively engaged in. I can talk about the National Center.
Sure. Yeah, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself was born out of a long-standing effort of Indigenous peoples to hold this government and to hold churches to account. And it really started out of two major things that were happening in the country. One was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was intended to actually provide recommendations to this country on what needed to change in order to prevent crises like the Oka crisis from occurring again. And those recommendations were not listened to very well by this country at all. We missed a massive opportunity to be in a much better state today through the failure to take those words seriously. But as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples traveled, it was hearing an incredible amount about residential schools, and it signaled that this was an issue that we had to look at very hard as a country. And it signaled that the relationship of Indigenous peoples with the Canadian state was fundamentally marred by this terrible history that was hidden right within our midst. Then some very incredibly brave survivors stepped forward and began to break silence on the abuses that they suffered in the residential schools. And that initial case that happened here on Vancouver Island out of the Port Alberni Residential School then paved the way for, really thousands and thousands and thousands of other survivors to step forward and make their voices heard, which in turn put incredible pressure on the government to respond, which then resulted in the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, and in turn, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, and one of the largest out-of-court settlements in the history of the world, actually. And what we have to understand in this settlement is that children were being compensated, this now adult survivors were being compensated for the fundamental human rights violations that they suffered simply by having attended a residential school. And then additional layers of compensation were provided for the absolutely atrocious levels of sexual and physical abuse that happened within the residential schools as well. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself was intended to conduct an in-depth investigation into the origins of the residential school system and the legacy that it's left. And we had the mandate to go out and talk to as many survivors as possible. That was a big part of my role. And then to assemble as complete a historical record as possible. And if you've been paying attention to the news of late, you know that assembling the historical record and gaining access to records from the government and churches was actually extraordinarily difficult. And I can attest firsthand to that. I used to have a full head of hair at the outset of this. Here we are. What can I say about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? We talked to over 7,000 residential school survivors and recorded their statements from coast to coast to coast. Murray Sinclair gave a really powerful interview about 3 weeks ago on CBC. I encourage you all to listen to it. And he was saying that even he, as being an extraordinarily experienced person within the Indigenous community, was shocked by what we were hearing. And the breadth and scope of the harm inflicted by the residential school system was something that even took some of the commissioners by surprise, especially in relation to the children that never returned home from the schools and the vast number of deaths that were happening inside of these residential schools. Most importantly, when we think about the TRC's calls to action, and this is something that is so fundamentally important, though, when we think about the combination of the TRC's calls to action, the centralizing of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the primary framework, and the principles of reconciliation, we have to understand that all of these things came from the collective expression of both hope and desire for change from the Indigenous community. And if we don't take those calls seriously, we are once again turning our back on the Indigenous community. It's not like the commission sat in a dark room somewhere and just wrote these things up out of thin air. This was the collective expression of solutions to long-standing problems that have to change in order for the society to become much more fair, much more equitable. Of course, we know that the Commission in its work found that Canada has committed genocide. We were left with absolutely no other words to describe what happened in this country other than those words. And I think it behooves us as members of the society to understand just how serious and just how significant those words are. And then to understand, conversely, just how generous the spirit of Indigenous peoples are as we continue to offer solutions and extend the hand of goodwill and good hope that one day this relationship will actually be rectified.
It'll work, yeah. I think it's also important to note, what I was talking about, that the survivors themselves really, at the beginning of this process, did not have the knowledge of the breadth and depth of the impact. They knew their own story. They knew the story of those people that they were close to, that they maybe went to school with. But even those people, because both my parents went to residential school. My mother was there for 8 years. My stepfather was there for 12 years. He went when he was 4 years old. So those of you that are listening, when you look over at your 4-year-old or your toddler, and you look at your grandchildren, try to appreciate that they were taking those children out of people's homes and putting them in these institutions at that age, and they were growing up in these schools with a great deal of harm. They weren't. It wasn't a loving place where they were sent to. They were actually damaged beyond belief by that. And almost 50% of these children never got home, or they got home and they died shortly thereafter from tuberculosis and other kinds of injuries. So that's important. The National Center came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They kind of refer to it almost like their child. That birthed this national center that is at the University of Winnipeg. There was a competition. University of Manitoba actually won that competition and actually hosts the National Center. And we have a governing circle that is made up of people that either were survivors or are intergenerational survivors, which I guess would be what I am. And we have a survivor circle of survivors who actually came through that experience and guide the work that the National Center does. And we are an archive. We hold the records and the photographs and the stories. And we're doing work with those people that are actually now identifying those missing children by helping them to match those children to the names, because a lot of those children are in unmarked graves. So it's going to take a lot of effort across the country to actually identify those children and get them back to where they belong. But we have an executive director. We have an amazing team of people who are very dedicated to this work. They work so hard. It's just amazing. And we have elders that work with us on a regular basis. And so we're there. We do education as well, and we do a lot of the kinds of things that provide the knowledge base to outside of the center itself. So right now, hopefully it'll grow very soon, but it's there, and you can access records for your grandparents or your great grandparents, and you just have to touch base. So I think it's really important people know that those records were preserved. Some of them, and I can also attest to the fact that some of those records are now subject to being destroyed through the IAP, the independent assessment process. So we have the records from the TRC. We have some of the records from the government. We have some of the records from the churches. But again, a lot of people don't want to turn those records over because those records hold information that people don't necessarily want other people to know, including the student-on-student abuse. It's not only about other people. So there's lots of damages, because you have to remember that more than 7 generations of Indigenous peoples went through these schools. And the result has been, to the detriment of Indigenous society, culture, language, and all those things. So there's a reason why Indigenous peoples are struggling sometimes. There's a reason why our communities are still working very hard on healing, and why we talk about healing so much, because it is so deeply embedded in our experience.
I often refer to the quote that I read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he summarizes his rebuttal to media claims, or when the media say it's all black on black crime and that's the main problem. He just says that, you can't shoot a man and then blame him for bleeding. And it often feels like that's been the case with residential schools, is that we had entire generations that were destroyed, like family units that were completely destroyed. I was on a call earlier today, and we were lamenting the fact that, you know, a lot of us don't have lullabies within our languages, and like that just hurts that like we can't share those things. And for me, like I didn't go to residential schools, but my grandparents and some of my aunts and uncles did, and you know, I can tell you, like the destruction of your family is a hard cycle to break. I remember when my son was born, he's 20 years old now. I had a hard time telling him I loved him because that's not something we did in our families, because that was taken away from us. Our parents never had anyone saying that to them, so they couldn't say it to us. And then I had a hard time saying it to my children. And that's been a hard cycle to break, even though it sounds so easy.
This continues through the child welfare system, right?
Definitely, yeah.
We have 52% of our kids in care, and they're being raised again in environments where they're not necessarily cared for the way they might be cared for in their families, or they're raised in different cultures. And then they're aging out into poverty and sometimes into justice systems. So, you know, there's still, it's not over. And I think that's what we really want you to understand out there, that it's not over. It's just changed form. And it's changed form into a system that actually is quite large and quite aggressive, and has, you know, is taking children, you know, there's birth alerts. There's so many things that we could explain to you given the time that is happening, and so many issues that are live, that, you know, when you say, what can we do to help? The kinds of things you can help is become educated about the kinds of issues that we're up against, and actually support, and actually, you know, argue on our behalf when you have the opportunity to do so, or you have the ear of somebody that can make the change.
You know, I think that's part of the whole history with all of this as well. And for those of you that have been paying attention to the media in the last little bit, you may have seen again a CBC story talking about the Beechwood Cemetery and Cindy Blackstock's efforts there to hold some of these historical figures up that are in that cemetery, and also hold others to account. And one of the historical figures that she speaks to often is a fellow by the name of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. Now, Peter Henderson Bryce was a very early whistleblower in the residential school system. He was writing reports in 1904, 1905, signaling the extraordinarily horrific levels of death that were occurring in the residential schools, even at that time. He later went on to write a seminal paper, which was largely discarded by the powers that be at the time, in 1921, that was called A National Crime, which signaled just how horrific the system was. I personally have talked to people that have been responsible for transporting children. I talked to a fellow who used to drive the train out of the northern reaches of Manitoba and would transport entire trainloads of kids and south to the residential schools. And he was an elderly man, non-Indigenous man. When I talked to him at one of the national events, and he could not even begin to tell me the story without tearing up and feeling really both helpless and ashamed, and also this deep sense of knowing that he was part of something that was wrong even at the time. And I think what this tells us is that we all have to become much more aware of the wrongs that exist in society right now. And we have to demand the change, and you have to use your voices. I mean, we're talking about using voice and the stages and the audiences that you have and the audiences that you create and the tens of thousands of people that you have the power of reaching. Well, that's, you know, both a privilege and a responsibility that I think comes along with that. And part of that responsibility is just to speak up and speak out, and to say both that never again will we let this happen. We will do everything we can to stop the violence that's happening right now. And we will also never forget. We will never forget what has happened. Because, I mean, again, we live in a country right now where we've had to go in front of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal 3 times to fight for justice for First Nations children right now, alive right now. Just last week, we passed human rights legislation, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act at the federal level, just last week. And it still was fought tooth and nail by certain members of political parties. And you can maybe guess who, you know, as this thing worked its way through the House of Commons and through the Senate. hold your politicians to account, demand better, demand that they don't back down on these fundamental principles, and talk to your friends and be the anti-racist person that you have to be in order to deconstruct the system of violence. Our history is filled with this overall complacency despite the presence of information right in our midst. And I think that's what's been so painful for people like myself and others, the community members right across the country that have known full well about Kamloops for decades. And it being both reassuring that those kids have been found, but also really frustrating that it's taken this long for Canadians to finally invest in the work that communities have been seeking and crying out for and really asking for so long.
And sharing. I mean, it's just, when you said that, it made me think of Thompson Highway and the plays that he put out like 30 years ago, that talked about these very things, and there's others. I mean, I watched the Dance Me Outside movie that was done, and they talked about missing and murdered women before anybody was talking about missing and murdered women. It's in the movie. The messaging is all there. Our people have been saying this very clearly for a very long time. I agree, and people have got to learn to listen, I suppose, to what they're saying.
A Lament for Confederation, 1967, by Chief Dan George. It's on CBC. It's well worth a watch. I mean, for the artists that are in the room, it's a stirring and moving piece, and that's 1967. Before we were even talking about 150, we were talking about 100, and there were such major changes that had to happen even at that time, and lamenting this, inequitable status even at that point. So.
For me, this is it feels like there's a lot of emotional effects of learning these truths. And I wanted to ask each of you, has there been a process throughout the TRC and the work that you're doing that helps people carry those stories and deal with the feelings that they pass, that come along with them?
Well, yes. And I think probably the most important thing is ceremony. It's actually taking people back to a spiritual practice. People, rather than picking up a bottle, pick up a drumstick, pick up a smudge, do something that's going to help you. Talk to, we have a lot of really skilled knowledge keepers and elders who have not put things down, who have actually managed to carry those knowledges forward. And they've been very helpful. I have had to go to ceremony. I'm sure Rye has gone to ceremony, to sweats and different things, when it gets a bit harder, because we also get overwhelmed by it. There's times when I feel like I can't take another story, that it's breaking me to hear about these. Because the thing that people don't realize, I think, is clear. These were children. I mean, now you look at them and a lot of them are elderly. They're not all old, but there's a lot of elderly people, and you think, oh, well, but they weren't. They were small children who were being brutalized in so many fundamental ways and who just missed their parents. I mean, my mother said the biggest damage that she felt from the whole experience was that she never got to know her parents. Her father died while she was in school. They were not allowed to go home to the funeral. Her mother died when she was quite young. So she said, I never got to know them. I never got to understand them. And as you've already said, they never learned. We had to teach her how to say I love you and how to hug, because I said chase her out the door. I'm going to hug you, and she's like, no. And I would but when I had children, she learned to be a grandparent. She learned to be the parent that she couldn't be for me to her grandchildren. And I think that's something that's the gift. And I think that's what Wap Kinew also talks about, is he didn't understand why his father was so angry until he heard his father say that he loved him. And he was like, really? You do? I just didn't know that. And now that I do, it changes everything.
Yeah, definitely.
I think some of the TRC calls too, Alan, really touch on the question that you've asked as well. And I think there's both the practices that we've developed throughout the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work, and then the work that's still very, very necessary. So if people have the time to look at the TRC calls to action, you'll see that health and well-being is actually very, very central in the work. And there's all sorts of different ways that we can understand health and wellness. One of the things that has happened, which I think is positive, is that when people did go through the TRC process and when they were thinking about sharing their experiences, that we at least had reached a point of trauma-informed understanding that health supports were present. And those were trained Western psychologists or other, therapists. But more often than that, they were these really skilled Indigenous workers called resolution health support workers or cultural practitioners that could do the work necessary to support survivors that comes both from a very rooted community-based perspective and also culturally informed. So be it smudging or be it brushing people off with cedar or helping people, say their prayers by their fire or summon the strength in order to get through the very difficult process of sharing one's experience. But, there's the whole question about what happens after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what still needs to be done. And we only have to look as far as, the recent report issued by Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond here in the province of British Columbia that has revealed the very brutal systemic racism that is still within the healthcare system now. So Indigenous peoples are still showing up within the healthcare system. We just saw this recently in Quebec as well, right? With Joyce, where we can't even get the physical healing that we need, oftentimes by virtue of the structures that are present within the healthcare system. Again, coming back to what Murray said recently too, in the aftermath of the Second World War, we built legions for veterans to come together and to be veterans with themselves. And we ask ourselves, where are those similar places for survivors right now? There's calls to action. And, I haven't gotten an update on this in the last little bit, but one of the calls to action talks about the pressing and profound need for healing centers in Nunavut, because for a long time, if you lived in Nunavut, you had to fly all the way south in order to get healing for residential schools work. So these are the inequalities and these are the inequities that still need to be addressed. And it's critical that we're aware of this, that we pay attention to these issues when they come up in the media, that we understand the ongoing justice and then demand the change. Again, this is the big thing, is we have to demand the change and we have to be part of making that change.
So I'm just watching, Stephanie just sent me a note. There's other communities that are now deeply engaged in this. I think there's something like 128 communities across Canada that are actively engaged in this search. So there's 140 in residential schools, sites. And so almost all of them are actively engaged in this, and they're coming up now every day. I think it's going to be very challenging for us to respond to the media on a regular basis. It's going to be important, I think, for you as people in these industries to actually help with this for sure. Whether it's about creating song. I mean, Gordon Downey, spoke from the stage. He sang about it. He wrote about it. He performed it, and people listened. So I'm really, getting concerned as more and more discoveries are made that people don't feel inundated or unable to respond because they may not have those sources. They may not have a psychologist that they can talk to. They may, there's a lot of people that I've talked to that are non-Indigenous who have said, I am completely undone by this. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to talk to. I don't know what to say. And I just need somebody to help me. And we can't do all of that alone. Rye and I can't respond to all those things, and you can't. But how do we, engage you as actors and songwriters to actually help us get the message out?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why I responded to Uncle Doug and Uncle Mark's request for help, is because I do see, like I said in a little earlier on, is every stage gives us an opportunity to show Canadians that we're just as special and unique as their loved ones. And I'm a firm believer that, like, those generalizations, when they reduce us to caricatures through professional sports logos, when they don't share our side of history, when the media just highlights our failures and not all of our accomplishments, it just, again, reduces us to numbers and makes it easier for predators and healthcare providers and the oath bound to just, cast us aside. we don't matter as much as their loved ones. And again, I think we can use every stage to show them, that we deserve just as much love and support as they give their family members.
Alan, you make such an important point too, because even just this past week here, we celebrated the Inspire Awards. And if you don't know what the Inspire Awards are, this is one of the major awards ceremonies, lifting up and celebrating some of the most thoughtful top leaders within the Indigenous community across the country. And if people take the time to go on to the Inspire site and look at not only the people that won this year, but all of the years past, and learn about them and learn about the incredible hard work they've been doing and the lifetimes worth of service in not just making this country better only for Indigenous peoples. Yes, it's that, but it's also making this country better for every single child, because in a society where racism and violence and prejudice is present, we are not a healthy society. We are actually a very sick society that is based on some fundamentally hurtful and destructive notions of how we're in a relationship with one another. And, I think, Alan, the point that you make, that while at once we understand the trauma, we should see what's happening across the country right now also as an incredible expression of strength, as Indigenous peoples are doing the exceptionally difficult work of honoring and expressing their love for those children that never returned home from the schools. Cynthia and I and others at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation were involved in some of those ceremonies when we began to share out some of the names. Speaking personally from my experiences there, that was really hard work to say you love so many children that had been lost in such horrible circumstances. And when we look at what is happening across the country right now, be it of leadership or be it of the health supports that are working to support survivors that are going through this, that are just the simple strength of survivors that are having to face this history once again, there is an inordinate and incredible amount of strength that we should be celebrating and should be acknowledging and should be lifting up, and turning to this record of strength and pursuit of human rights and justice as being an exemplar of some of the people not only that we need to know about, but quite honestly need to follow.
Definitely. We have a question in the chat here from Kim Gucci, another auntie or cousin from out west. Kim asked, how do you feel about celebrating Canada Day now, given the truth that came to light? I'm guessing it's in that context.
Anti-Canada Day. You know what, I've never, I have members of my family who are non-Indigenous who celebrate Canada Day. I kind of don't celebrate Canada Day, but I celebrate my family. So, if everybody gets together on a day when there's a holiday and everybody's at the lake and we're all sitting around having, watching our kids, it's fine. I don't go out of my way to celebrate a day, especially as we move forward and as more of these discoveries have been made, and as more of the residential schools, the Indian hospitals, the child welfare system, the justice system, which still hasn't corrected itself. As those things continue, there really isn't anything to celebrate. We have to actually start to say to Canada, you don't even deserve the name that you took from the Haudenosaunee people. That is the name that you call yourself, which is about a village, which is about a community. And yet, it's so divided by privilege and advantage and race, it seems. So there's a lot of things that we have to talk about. If we use this day to actually get to those conversations, then I think it's worthwhile. But if we don't use those days to do that, it's like Sorry Day in Australia. It hasn't done anything specific.
Oh, you got muted by the cat.
The cat.
Wow, she stepped on my keyboard.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a lot of things that are going on, right? And Sorry Day in Australia is one of those supposedly celebratory things. And again, the community is very divided about whether or not that's something to celebrate. There she is.
And I know, for me, we're talking a bit about music here. I did actually come out of one experience that I had and did write a song about Canada specifically, because I can see the exact moment in my life where the image of Canada just finally broke for me. Like it just, and what happened is Canada as a concept just went from this idea to this concept of just mourning. I felt bad for Canada. Like it just broke somehow. And I can see what the moment that it happened. I was driving along Highway 6 in Manitoba, and there was all the grain cars lined up on the side of the highway there. And, you know, it had the Canada and the Wheat Board logo, and it just cracked at that point for me. I've never felt the same about Canada ever since, but I still have a lot of hope for Canada. And I have great hope. I have great hope that we can take some of the generosity that has been extended to people fleeing all forms of oppression from around the world and understand that as a strength of source. Understand that Canada, to a certain extent, has been a bastion of safety in a sea, oftentimes, of mass and flagrant human rights violation. And I have hope that as Canadians look into their own histories and understand what pushed them out of their own countries towards this country, that we can find it collectively within ourselves to extend that same principle of safety now to Indigenous peoples. Because in the creation of safety of others, we have made this country an exceptionally dangerous place for the original inhabitants, and that's not right. And that is the Canada that still needs to be built, and it still has to be realized. And I still have hope that it can be constructed, but it's not going to get constructed through hanging on to some kind of Pollyanna idea that this place is, you know, all, you know, roses and, you know, easygoing. This is the only pathway forward to that Canada is through a recognition of the genocide that has occurred and the change that has to occur on a fundamental level, actually on all levels, to be realized.
Yeah, and I'll just share, like, our little festival, we as an organization don't celebrate colonial milestones. And so that includes the annual Canada Day celebrations, that includes Canada 150. Last year was Manitoba 150. And so even though there's significant pots of money tied to those events, it's not something that we like to celebrate. That being said, I often encourage Indigenous artists to take every performance opportunity they're given and use those stages to educate Canadians. And so I know there's a number of cities that have outright canceled their celebrations this year, but I mean, if you've been offered an opportunity to perform and take the stage in front of thousands of people, I mean, I think it's an excellent opportunity to do some research and to come up with some speaking points, and also use the opportunity to drive people to your email list. And I would say that your email list gives you another opportunity to educate Canadians. And Cynthia has actually given us a link to a number of book recommendations. And those types of resources, I think, go a long way with audiences in Canada and overseas even. And so I think, again, I think organizations like festivals can make decisions not to accept that kind of money and not to celebrate colonial milestones. But if you're an artist and you've got a platform, I think it's important to use it as many times as possible, or to your advantage. Also, we're getting close to the end of our time, our hour. I wanted to dig into a little bit more of the calls to action. And this is for either of you. I think I've seen the calls to action mention the arts twice. And so I'm really wondering, like, as music, as the arts, people in music and people in the arts, what can we do aside from commemorating residential schools to, you know, to keep the work going?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that there's only a couple spaces. And I think, you know, I remember listening to Marie Wilson talk about the calls to action and how they sat down and they really tried to be as comprehensive as possible. Like they tried to get as much in there that was, you know, brought forward to them from the survivors. And they may just have not really got that part because, you know, maybe they're not actively engaged there. And youth only got one. 66, I mean, and how important are our youth, right? Very important. So I think that, I mean, I wouldn't base your commitment to the process of reconciliation on those calls to action. I would look at all of those calls to action as a collective and say, is there anything in here that I can do as a theater performer, a singer, a poet? The education piece is a very important part, and taking the time to go into schools and actually offer up skits and knowledge to students. The child welfare piece, to speak up against birth alerts, or to talk about aging out kids and making sure they don't end up in jail or in poverty. Like, there's all kinds of areas where you can actually take on the calls to action that are not necessarily geared specifically at you. Even the whole question around the churches. There's a number of just sort of general calls to action that I think anybody can engage in. Find the thing that really makes you, get passionate and follow that lead and go in that direction and utilize it somehow, because speaking up and learning about this is going to be one of the most important things you do, because if you don't have the ammunition and the ability to actually speak effectively to what it is you're trying to achieve, then people are not going to listen to you. And do it with a good heart. I listen to some of the faith keepers speak, and they don't ever shake their finger nor say, somebody's right or wrong. They're very gentle with it. They talk about, that fire, like we all have that fire within us. We're all members of humanity, and we all need to look at each other that way, and not as different or strange or unattainable or inaccessible. So understanding that part of, I think, is going to be the most important thing, and we can help you with that. Like, we're going to provide you with some books. Alan is going to provide you with more conversations. Rye is accessible. He's working in library situations. I'm working with students going into the north. There's all kinds of things that you can do, and I just encourage you to find the thing that makes you happiest when you're doing it, and do that, even though it's a very dire conversation. If it makes you feel better and stronger to do it, do it.
And just adding on that, I think as I approach the TRC's calls to action, it's important that we not read the calls to action in isolation of the other really important buttressing or foundational components to the TRC's calls to action that actually fully inform how we're supposed to do our work and the values or principles upon which we're supposed to base our work. So I've copied a few things into the chat, and hopefully they're going to get out to all of the panelists, but I would really encourage you to look at the principles of reconciliation that were put forward in the reconciliation handbook, really, of the TRC. There's a whole volume on reconciliation. And one of the principles is Principle 7, I think, supporting Aboriginal people's cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. But supporting Aboriginal people's cultural revitalization, that's something each and every one of you in the arts sector can do. That can be collaborations, that can be stage time, that can be co-development, that can be following instead of leading, right? That can be advocating for funding, that can be ensuring that there are people present to kick off your event, and then not just having them there and underpaying them, but paying them properly or paying them really well, recognizing that a big part of reconciliation is also economic reconciliation as well, based on the theft of land and all sorts of displacement from economy that has happened over time. It also says reconciliation, one of the principles says reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including going on and on and on. You can do this too. A lot of festivals have workshops. Make that part of your workshops, invite Indigenous peoples in, create space, take good care of them. Don't appropriate their voices. Don't use them, but create space for Indigenous peoples to share what they need to share. And then remember that all of this is also now going to be happening under a much broader framework of human rights in this country. And that in Indigenous peoples, through this legislation, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, are now recognized to have a vital and full place within Canadian society. We're just getting to this point now, but it's not enough to say, oh, this is an act of benevolence to invite Indigenous peoples in. This is an exercise of the fundamental rights that Indigenous peoples have to be Indigenous in their own country, right? So we really have to make sure that we're following these human rights-based principles and frameworks and upholding and creating the space by which Indigenous peoples can be Indigenous, whatever that looks like, and just create the space.
Yeah.
That was perfect. That was the answer I've been looking for the last couple of years, actually.
All right.
Yeah, no, that sums up a lot of the questions that I had. And yeah, no, just wonderful, wonderful input. I also just want to note, like within music, we're just in the process of launching a National Indigenous Music Office or organization. And one of our tasks on our to-do list is to create our own calls to action for the music industry. And part of that, yeah, part of that is like for our festival uncles and aunties here that program festivals, is one of the main calls to action that I'd like to see is for them to start contracting Indigenous artists well in advance of the December tour deadline at Canada Council, so that these artists have an opportunity to get their travel funded and granted ahead of their travel dates in the summer. That's the main challenge that I've encountered while working with Indigenous artists over the last 15 years, is that, you know, oftentimes our music festivals across the country are contracting these artists as an afterthought. It is what it feels like when those contracts or offers don't come in until like February, March, or April for events in June, July, and August. And so there's a number of other things within our industry that we need help with in order to get our message out there and to, you know, normalize Indigenous culture in our own lands.
Even access to those grants that you're talking about, you know, quite often when we look at the history of those grants, who's actually getting the grants? And quite often it's people who are working, they're saying, well, I'm doing this on behalf of Indigenous people. They're not actually Indigenous themselves. So a significant number of those grants are going to people that really shouldn't be applying for them, or at least if they are applying for them, they should be working very closely in relationship to the artists that they're actually talking about. So I mean, I think that's an issue as well.
Procurement strategies, you know, I mean, if you're having your festival planning lunch, is there an Indigenous company that you can buy your lunch from? You know, can you buy supplies or anything like that from various suppliers? There are, and you should have Indigenous procurement strategies, especially if you're going to be operating in Indigenous lands as well. And that's just
it always baffles me, like when you think of it, like these are our lands, since our families have been here for time immemorial, and we're displaced from almost every public activity. And a part of it is like the racist policies, and a part of it is just you know, the access to the resources, access to the grants, and in music, another big obstacle is the operating grants. Our organization doesn't have access. We're not even allowed to apply for them. It's by invitation only at the Manitoba Arts Council and Winnipeg Arts Council. And so that maintains a systemic, or maintains and strengthens the status quo, because if we don't access operating grants, we can't make promises to artists well in advance of that tour deadline. We also can't make promises to corporate sponsors because we don't know what our conditions are going to be like, how much money we have. And I mean, there's so much systemic change that needs to happen in the arts and the music as well. And so if you have a voice and you have, you're being asked to consult, or you're in a position of authority in making decisions, then, you know, equity and sovereignty for Indigenous arts Indigenous music is really important.
One of the things Thunder Bay did was actually look at the Indigenous dollar. You know, Thunder Bay was, people that are experiencing a lot of racism, and the Lakehead worked with Fort William and some of the local communities, and they started to quantify the contributions that Indigenous peoples make to the city of Thunder Bay. They come in for hotels, they come in for meetings, they come in for theater, they come in for education, they come in to shop. And it was at the time, this is like probably about 10 or more years ago, it was already something like 8% of the GDP, which translated to well over $500 million. It's now more than that. It's increased significantly. And that made a huge difference for people somehow. You know, it's like this, again, this burden of proof. You know, the fact is that there is a significant contribution by the Indigenous arts community. You know, Thompson Highway started that a long time ago with the Native Performing Arts to demonstrate very clearly and unequivocally the value of that industry. And I don't think that that's gone away. And I think sometimes we have to start to define that for our own self and our own use, so we actually can see when we quantify the value, we can have more appreciation for it ourselves. Never mind, the fact that sometimes we need it for other people. But I really think that we need to know we put a lot into this country every single day. And we are very much a part of its success and its value. So we should never forget that. And we should allow our children the privilege, absolutely, of knowing that everything they do counts, that every child counts, and they matter. So I think, it's great that you're doing this. I think we need to do it again and again and again.
And again and again. Yeah, definitely. Maintain that momentum. Like we said at the start, is looking past the media cycle and continue to educate ourselves and educate our audiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're at the end of our hour, and so I'm just gonna thank Rye and thank Cynthia, thank Uncle Doug and Uncle Mark for this opportunity. I think this message. We have a small group with us on the chat, but I believe in our power to amplify these messages as a music community, as a music industry, and so again. I think we've done some good work here, and I wanted to just acknowledge you guys first and foremost, because I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone here has also learned a lot.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Everyone. Yeah,
Nice
thanks for taking the time.
The
Thanks for the
work.
invitation.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Okay, see you
Hope to see
later.
you guys in person soon.
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, me too. All right, take care. Stay safe.
Okay.